Okay, so let's talk a little bit about objections to utilitarianism. We're going to spend a significant amount of time talking about objections to utilitarianism. Why is that? Well, because that's what Mill does. In his book Utilitarianism, he only spends a little bit of time talking about what utilitarianism is, and then he spends the rest of the book essentially trying to defend utilitarianism against objections. Predominantly because the theory itself is pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple, at least in theory. Right? In practice, it's very, very difficult. But the objections to it are many and are sometimes profound and raise really interesting ethical questions and philosophical questions more broadly. So we're just going to focus on two objections to utilitarianism. So we're going to talk about the objection from rights, what I'm going to call the objection from rights, and the objection from justice. The objection from rights is the kind of objection that Immanuel Kant would make, and he is the person we're going to be discussing next. The objection from justice is the kind of objection that John Rawls would make. We're not going to discuss John Rawls in this class, although I encourage you to take a political philosophy class. John Rawls is an American philosopher, and he's generally considered to be the most important philosopher of maybe the last 60 years. So let's talk about the objection from rights. So the way that these objections work is they say, if utilitarianism is true, it seems to have really unethical consequences. So utilitarianism, remember, is a theory about what's right and wrong. It's a theory about morality. It's a theory about ethics. And so one way you can try to critique utilitarianism is by saying that, let's assume for the sake of argument that utilitarianism is true, and let's try to show that utilitarianism has counterintuitive and essentially immoral consequences. Because if you're developing an ethical theory and it has immoral consequences, that's a problem for your theory, right? And so this is the way these objections work. So the objection from rights basically says, utilitarianism seems to approve of gross violations of individual rights. Yeah? So the objection here is utilitarianism seems to approve of gross violations of individual rights. All right, so let's put some flesh on these bones. Yeah. So again, we're assuming for the sake of argument that utilitarianism is true, and then we're going to try to show that utilitarianism has really counterintuitive and actually immoral consequences, and that's supposed to show that the theory itself is flawed, right? And so Mill is sensitive to this. As I say, he spends most of his time dealing with objections. So the way this might work, let me ask you a question. Given what I've just told you about utilitarianism, do you think that it would be morally permissible to murder somebody in the following circumstances, according to utilitarianism? Let's imagine that in our class we have 10 deathly sick people. One person is suffering from heart failure, another person is their lungs are shot, another person is suffering from liver failure, kidney, another person kidneys, and so on. All right, so we have 10 people who are literally on the brink of death. Would it be morally permissible, according to utilitarianism, to just grab one person in our class who's completely healthy and to murder them and to harvest them for their organs? So we take the heart and give it to the person who needs a heart transplant, we give the lungs to the person who needs the lungs, and so on, and we end up saving 10 lives and only losing the one. Would that be morally permissible? Given just what we've said superficially, simplistically about utilitarianism, does that sound like utilitarianism would say yes, or do you think that utilitarianism would say no? Well, we have two options. We can either murder the person or we cannot murder the person. If we murder the person, one person suffers, obviously, but 10 people live. If we don't murder the person, then that one person is happy because they live, but the 10 other people are unhappy because they die. Yeah? So, cost-benefit analysis seems like utilitarianism. It seems like utilitarianism would say, well, buckle up, Billy. You're going down. No, whatever. Yeah. It seems like that's what utilitarianism would say. And the idea is that everybody recognizes that's messed up. Right? So hopefully, I would assume that you would agree, grabbing some random person and murdering them and harvesting them for their organs would just simply be wrong. So that's a problem for utilitarianism because it seems to give it seems to give bad advice. It seems to say this is the moral thing to do, and everybody's like, but it's not the moral thing to do. So that means there's a problem with your ethical theory. So Mill is sensitive to this. So here's how I think Mill would respond. He does not respond to this objection specifically in utilitarianism or anywhere to my knowledge, but he does say something that is relevant in his book On Liberty, which is a very, very interesting work. I highly recommend it. It's very easy to read, although kind of boring. But in On Liberty, he introduces a principle which many of you are probably familiar with and have probably invoked in your own life, but have never heard articulated or didn't even know where it comes from. And it's called the harm principle. And so Mill is going to try to defend himself against this objection. He is not going to say that it's okay to just grab an innocent person and murder them and harvest them for their organs. He does not think that that's true. That means that he needs to tweak his theory. He needs to change something about his theory. And so he does. But the thing is, he does it in this other book. So in On Liberty, he introduces this principle called the harm principle. And the basic idea is that unless somebody is going to harm somebody else, you have to leave that person the hell alone. He doesn't put it this way. He uses a lot more swear words. No, I'm just kidding. So he says the harm principle is basically, unless somebody is going to harm somebody else, you have to leave them the hell alone. That's called the harm principle, right? So unless somebody is causing harm to another person, he says that person should have complete autonomy over their own bodies and over their own lives, right? He is a classical liberal. He believes in individual autonomy. He thinks that people should be able to live how they see fit, all right? So unless somebody is about to harm somebody else, you have to leave them alone. It's a really interesting principle. So this means, for example, I can ask you a question. Would Mill think that it is okay for a person to sit at home and to drink vodka and eat Cheetos until their heart explodes? That's pretty much what I'm going to do this afternoon. No. Would that be morally permissible? Yeah, Mill's like, yeah, you have to leave them alone. You can't mess somebody. Yeah, so other people, everybody else, and that includes the government, and includes also other people. They cannot mess with you if you're not going to harm somebody else. If you're going to harm yourself, that's fine. That's your own damn business, he basically thinks. But if you're going to harm somebody else, then other people maybe can interfere with your behavior. But if your actions are only self-regarding, he says, then nobody can interfere with your behavior. They're welcome to come talk to you. They're welcome to say, like, hey, I think this is a really bad decision. I don't think that you should do this. I'm assuming your parents or something like that would do that. Be like, you shouldn't be throwing your life away like this. But he says, that person can't punish you. They can't throw you in prison. They can't fine you. They can't in any way try to harm you financially or bodily or in any other way in order to try to get you to change your behavior, because he says the individual is sovereign over their own lives and over their own bodies. Make sense? Right? So that means that people should be able to live however they see fit. Super interesting philosophical questions pop up around this topic, especially recently when there's been this kind of wave of discussion about whether or not words can be a kind of violence. And that's obviously been, like, this discussion's been supercharged after the Will Smith, Chris Rock incident, and now with the stabbing of Salman Rushdie. So some free speech people have said that both of these incidents show why it's dangerous to conflate speech with violence, because they're like, no, speech is not violence. Like, stabbing somebody with a knife is violence. Punching somebody, that's violence. Words are something else. In any case, there's lots of debates about what harm is that come up around this context, right? So Mill wants to have a very stringent definition for what counts as harm. For him, harm means like primarily bodily harm, maybe like economic harm, but primarily bodily harm. He wants to separate harm from offense. He wants to say that those are two different things. Why? Because he's trying to protect individuals' rights to live as they see fit. And if offense counts as harm, that means that other people would, in some cases, be entitled to interfere with their behavior, because they would say, I'm offended, that is to say, harmed by your behavior. And so Mill wants to say, no, offense and harm are very, very different things. The fact that somebody is offended by your behavior does not entitle them to mess with your behavior or with your speech or with anything else, right? It's only harm that we should regulate. And even then, he says, in not every case, right? He thinks that sometimes harm are actually acceptable. But if somebody is not harming anybody else, then absolutely you should leave them alone, 100%. It's only when they're harming somebody else that you should even ask the question, should we regulate their behavior? Okay? So harm is a necessary condition for regulating somebody's behavior. It's not even sufficient, right? So some types of harm he thinks actually should be allowed. Anyway, so there's lots that can be discussed here, but it relates to all sorts of stuff like trans rights or, things like this. Like, should a trans person be able to use the bathroom of their choice? What do you think Mill would say about that? Try to give you a second. He doesn't raise the question, obviously, but because he's writing back in, like, whatever this is, 1859. But I think he would say, trans people should be able to use the bathroom of their choice. The fact that it offends other people is irrelevant, he would say. It doesn't harm them. Of course, somebody might try to argue that it does harm. That's why these things are interesting. But my expectation is that he would say, no, that's a kind of offense. It's not harm, right? People are just like, oh, my stars, right? That kind of thing. It's offense, right? Would it be okay, for maybe an easier example, would it be okay for me to wear a shirt that says F you? Just like walk around the street? Like, literally, not bleeped out too, like the actual swear word. Yeah, F you. Mill will be like, yeah, you should be able to do that if you want, right? Of course, people will be like, my stars, right, and be offended by that. But so what? It's not a kind of harm. Then they might be pissed off about it and be like, yeah, if you do, pal. And I'll be like, yeah, whatever, right? Because we both have free speech, and they can tell me they don't like what I'm doing. Fine, that's part of free speech, is to critique other people and criticize them and say you shouldn't be doing that stuff. That's totally legitimate, but he doesn't think you should be able to regulate my behavior or force me to take the shirt off just because it upsets other people, right? Again, he is a classical liberal, which is to say he wants people to be able to live as they see fit. That means that he would want gay people to be able to live as they see fit, trans people to be able to live as they see fit, religious people, he's an atheist himself, but religious people should be able to live as they see fit. And that's why he wants to say harm, we have to really construe harm in a really narrow way as something like bodily harm. Because if we count offense as harm, then conservatives would be able to say to trans people, you're offending, that is to say harming me, and so you shouldn't be able to use the bathroom of your choice, right? That would lead to a kind of illiberalism, right? Because people often forget this, especially in discussions around freedom of speech, is they forget that works both ways, right? Progressives can say your speech is harming me, right? Yeah, and so we should then be able to use the government to shut you up. But they forget that the very next step is going to be conservatives making the same exact move. So they're going to say, you talking about trans rights offends me, it hurts me, it harms my kids if you talk about gay rights in school. This is where this is going to go. Right? So somebody said, I forget who it is, somebody said that if you're going to empower the government to do something, for the next 10 years, there should be an embargo on your side being able to use that power, which is to say, if you're going to give the government the right to regulate regulate speech, if progressives really want to do that, then what they should do is for the next 10 years, Trump is going to be in charge of who regulates freedom of speech. Yeah? Then do you still want to do it? Probably not. Exactly. This is what liberals will say as opposed to progressives. So some progressives are saying we should regulate speech because it constitutes a kind of harm, and liberals will respond. They're not the same. Progressives and liberals are not the same. Liberals will respond and will say, No, that's a really bad idea, because then you're just going to be giving conservatives a cudgel, right? We need to have the same, which is to say, a weapon against minorities. Basically, we're going to be stymieing, progressive activism by doing this. You're going to be, because who benefits from freedom of speech? As historically people have known, Frederick Douglass and people like this. I think it was Frederick Douglass who said that if we had real freedom of speech in the South, that slavery would be abolished in 5 years. This is what he said before the Civil War. I believe it was Frederick Douglass, right? Because who was trying to prevent freedom of speech in the South before the Civil War? It wasn't like the slaves were doing it. Like it was the slave owners who were trying to suppress freedom of speech. It's always marginalized people who benefit from freedom of speech. There have been a number of books written on this about people who study freedom of speech. It's always marginalized people because they're the people who are trying to change things, which is to say they're disempowered, right? It's always the people who have power, who want to suppress speech because they don't want things to change. So if you're getting rid of freedom of speech, you're empowering people. You're empowering people to suppress minority voices. That's almost invariably what you end up doing. Even if it seems like you're going to be empowering minority voices, within 5 or 10 years, you're going to end up doing the opposite, because it's always the people in power who are going to be able to leverage power. People who are powerful don't need freedom of speech. They have money or whatever they have. It's always people who are, fighting the uphill battle for expanding rights and for new liberties and new freedoms that need these kinds of protections. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. If you want to give the government a power, you should imagine that the other side are going to be in charge of exercising that power for the next 10 years. I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. And then do you actually want your opponents to have that power? And if you don't, then you shouldn't be trying to get that power for yourself, because we should be trying to be behaving in a fair and equal way in terms of politics. Anyway, this is kind of how Mill thinks about these kinds of things, because he's a liberal, not necessarily a progressive. There's overlap there, but they're not identical. Okay, so to bring this back to the original objection, how would Mill respond? He would say, well, we should not be capturing somebody, hooding them, pulling them into a van, and murdering them and carving them up for their organs. Why? Because that person's minding their own damn business. They're protected by the harm principle. They're not harming somebody else. And moreover, he would say, it would make society incredibly unhappy if you did that, right? If you tried to enact as a policy that the government is going to just like kidnap people and murder them who are healthy in order to take their organs from them in order to give it to sick people, everybody's going to be freaking terrified all the time. Whenever a car pulls up, they're going to be like, ah, right? Because they don't know if they're just about to be kidnapped and murdered, right? So the overall happiness of society would decline. And so he thinks the harm principle is a way of protecting individual rights, right? That's what the harm principle is about. It's about protecting individual rights, people's ability to speak, to live, to assemble, to worship as they see fit, provided that they're not harming other people. It provides a buffer of protection. And he says you do not want to penetrate that, right? You do not want to penetrate that, because if you do, then it's going to make society as a whole a lot less happy. Okay, so he does not think that it would be okay to murder somebody and harvest them for their organs. He thinks that they're protected by individual rights, by the harm, which is to say by the harm principle, and that violating that would make society actually much, much more unhappy. All right, so that's objection number 1. Let's turn to objection number 2. Second objection, here we go. So the second objection is the one that I said that John Rawls would make. John Rawls has been one of the most intense critics of utilitarianism in the past 60 years or so. He's no longer living, but he was a professor at Harvard, and he cared very much about inequality. And so one of the problems with utilitarianism, as the objection goes, is the objection from justice, is that utilitarianism, again, the way that these objections work is that we assume that utilitarianism is true, and then we try to show that utilitarianism has really counterintuitive and immoral consequences, or immoral prescriptions, and that creates a problem for the theory. So Rawls would say one of the problems with utilitarianism is that it seems like utilitarianism would approve of massive inequalities in society, like massive inequalities in society. All right, so here's an example. Given what we've said about utilitarianism, would utilitarianism approve of the following situation, where we take 5% of the population and not enslave them, but like put them in essentially sweatshops, have them work ridiculously difficult jobs for ridiculously long hours in order to make goods and services for the rest of us. So would it be okay to take 5% of the population and to force them into like work camps so that they're making clothes and jewelry and TVs and cars and everything else for everybody else? So the rest of us get to live high in the hog? So I was going to say, I don't know if is that a thing, or is that just a product of the fact that my dad was born in Kansas? I don't know if it's a real thing. Anyway, so the rest of us are living large. There you go. The rest of us are living large, but those 5 people suffer. 5%, not 5 people. 5% of the population really suffers. Would that be permissible? Well, again, it seems like we could either not do this, in which case everybody's happiness level kind of remains what it is, or we can do this and have 5% of the population be really, really miserable, but the rest of us are really, really happy, and it seems like, well, there's a lot more of us than them, so it ends up being kind of majority rules. This is always one of the difficulties with utilitarianism, is that you're supposed to consider the happiness of everybody who's affected, but in practice, it oftentimes boils down to majority rules, and minorities get screwed. Not minorities in the racial or sexual identity sense, but just smaller groups of people, right? So yeah, it seems like it always ends up being like nearly always ends up up being majority rules, and so whatever the majority wants ends up being that's what produces the greatest amount of happiness for all people affected. So some people just get the short end of the stick, and this is the thing that Rawls is really concerned about, the fact that some people get the short end of the stick, and it's usually like the most disadvantaged people already who get the short end of the stick. It's like disabled people or something like that who get the short end of the stick all the time. So that's one thing that Rawls cares about. So, but it seems like utilitarianism would actually approve of this. They would say, yeah, I mean, 5% of the population, it sucks for them. They're going to be really, really, really unhappy, but the rest of us are going to be like, this is going to be fantastic, right? So it seems like utilitarianism would approve of this. All right, that's the objection. Here, Mill's response is interesting. So we're actually going to talk about two utilitarians here. We're going to talk about how Mill would respond and how Peter Singer would respond. So Mill actually kind of wants to bite the bullet on this a little bit. I mean, I don't think he would be okay with sweatshops. Oh, by the way, I give this as a hypothetical example, but I hope you already get this is not exactly hypothetical. There are sweatshops, right? The people who make our phones and stuff like that. And there are kids like in the Congo or wherever it is. They're like in cobalt mines who produce the metals that we use in like our smartphones and stuff. Like the clothes that we wear, the technology that we use, a lot of this stuff is produced in situations that we would find absolutely deplorable if we were part of it. So yeah, I'm like in the Foxconn factories. They had suicide nets in these factories. Yeah, and they weren't there for the decor. It's because people's lives sucked, right? Some of these people work in these sweatshops and they make like, pennies an hour, and they're just doing the same repetitive task over and over again. Think about like you're sewing buttons onto shirts or whatever it is, and you're doing these, tasks over and over again. How much that would hurt if you've like worked on a house even for a day. You know that you can be incredibly sore afterwards, and even if you don't have to do it again. Imagine just doing that day after day after day for very long hours. It can be brutal. So yeah, I've heard some estimates. You don't quote me on these figures that say stuff like, if our smartphones were produced stateside with our, expectations for pay, that those things would cost like thousands of dollars. And the fact that they will just like give them to you for free for like, sign up for our new plan or whatever is a function of the fact that the people who are making them are being exploited. So this is not hypothetical. So Mill wouldn't be okay with exploitation. He would not be okay with sweatshops. He would want a minimum standard of life for people who are working. That is the case. He says something like this, that he would want a kind of a significant standard of living. But he is also okay with substantial inequalities in society. So he does kind of bite the bullet on this. He wouldn't be okay with sweatshops. He wouldn't be okay with outright exploitation. But inequality, he's like, yeah, like even substantial inequality, where you have like billionaires and other people are not billionaires. He's like, yeah, why do you think that that's so bad? And you're like, because of inequality. And he's like, well, like, what would it be like if we didn't have these kinds of people in society who are the movers and shakers and produce new kinds of technology? He's like, everybody benefits from having a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs or Elon Musk in our society. And so if we incentivize them to, produce things that the rest of us benefit from, then like, whatever, like the society as a whole is better off, right? He would say that like the people who are least well off in society actually benefit even from having like from smartphones, from having computers. So let's spell this out a little bit more. Mill thinks, and he says this in On Liberty, that it is important that we make room and make space for and try to create geniuses. This is what he says. So think about like education, for example, which we have inequality in our education system. The kind of education that you would get in a community college is just not the same as what you would get at Princeton or Harvard or MIT. It's just not the same, right? So do we want to try to flatten out our educational system and try to make it so that all the education that anybody gets at any college is roughly the same? Mill would say, no, you actually don't want that. What you want is inequalities in the education system so that the best and brightest can get the best education and produce things that the rest of us will benefit from, right? Because Patrick Casey is not as smart as somebody or as creative as somebody like a Bill Gates. And so the only way that you're going to get equality in the education system is if you bring down the Harvards and MITs and Yales and stuff like that. And you don't want to do that because you want the best and brightest to have the best possible education because they're going to be the people who are the most creative and the most productive in society. And you want them to be productive. Why? Not just because they're going to make a shit ton of money, although he thinks that's true, but because the rest of us, what produces the greatest amount of happiness for everybody affected, because the rest of us benefit from having them in our society. That's what he thinks. Right? So you don't want to level out the educational system. You want to have inequalities and hierarchies in the educational system so that the best and brightest can go get educated by the best and brightest so that they can be obscenely productive because the rest of us benefit from that. And it is the case that everybody does benefit from having Steve Jobs in society and Bill Gates. I mean, 40 years ago, practically nobody has a computer. Now everybody carries a freaking supercomputer essentially in their freaking pockets. Like that's insane. It is insane. Like it is ridiculous the amount of the changes that we've had technologically. Everybody benefits from that. Even poorer people, at least in our society, not worldwide, but at least poorer people in our society have access to things like smartphones, which is just ridiculous. Which is to say that they have more access to more information than Aristotle had at any point in his life. Now you think by a wide margin, like a wide margin. If any of those kings of old would just murder, steal, do anything they could, basically, maybe not, but they would be strongly tempted to. In order to acquire just what you carry around in your pocket. I mean, you have access to all of the writings of Plato that we have. That's in your pocket. And Aristotle, Euclid, Shakespeare, right? I mean, that stuff that you have access to just at your fingertips is unbelievable. And people would have, walked over their mothers. It was out the phrase. I'm using all these phrases I don't really understand. They would have done, all sorts of things to have access to what you just carry around in your pocket. And so somebody like Mill would say that is a product of free markets. He is a classical liberal, so he is in favor of liberty in every domain of life, individually and economically. And he thinks that we should allow markets to do what they do, which is that they tend to be obscenely productive, and everybody benefits from that. And so he would also say people on his team would say have carried the argument even further. They've said that not only it is the case that everybody benefits from having geniuses in society, but not only that, but they say when the economy grows, everybody benefits from that. So even poor people. So there's this phrase, a rising tide will raise all ships. You may have heard this phrase. So the basic idea with that is look, think back to, nobody's in favor of sweatshops. They're horrible. Again, I'm not endorsing this argument. I'm just saying people will make this argument. They will say things like, look what happened historically. I mean, India, if you look back 50 years ago, India was a prime example of being the most poverty-stricken country on the face of the earth, practically. That and Bangladesh. And now their middle class, their population is huge, but their middle class is larger than the United States is, I believe. They also have 1.2 billion people, so they have a lot more people than us. And there is still a lot of abject poverty in India, but there's also tremendous economic growth. Same thing in China, right? The economic growth there when they allow markets in has been extraordinary, and it's pulled literally billions of people out of poverty. So you may or may not know this, but maybe, I don't know if you realize this, but the number of people who are living in abject poverty has dropped drastically over the past several decades. Excluding the pandemic, we've gone from having whatever, it was just 40 years ago, it was something like 40% of the world's population lived on less than $1.90 a day. 40% of the world's population. Now that number is down to less than 10%. That's crazy. The number of people who have been pulled out of abject poverty over the past several decades is extraordinary. And this is what these kind of free market kind of people will say. They will say sweatshops were ugly, but nevertheless, competition over time will pull people out of poverty. Some people will live and die and spend their entire lives in abject poverty, but over time. So they will say things like this. They'll say, this is what happened. It's sweatshops, they suck, but whatever. Nike is trying to cut costs back in the 70s, or when I'm just making this up, but Nike's trying to cut costs in the 70s, and so what do? They open a factory in India, and instead of paying somebody in America, whatever, $1.25 an hour, I don't know what it was in the 70s, they will pay them, or $2 an hour, whatever it was. They'll pay somebody in India 3 cents an hour to do the same thing, which is, sweatshop. It's miserable. The person who's living in those kinds of conditions will have a miserable life their whole life. But then what will happen is Nike is able to drop its prices significantly because their costs have gone down, and they're able to put a lot of pressure on other people like Adidas, or I don't think Under Armour is even a thing then, but they'll be able to undercut them in terms of their prices in the market. And they're going to make a lot of money because they've cut their costs, and they can cut their prices, but then their profit margins are just going to explode. So what's going to happen is, of course, Adidas is just going to be well, shucks, I wish we had thought of that. I guess we just have to bow our heads and, fold up shop. And that's what happened. No, what Adidas did is they were well, shit, what are they going to do? They're going to build a factory down the street, and they're going to do the same thing. And instead they're going to be Nike's already hired you. We'll pay you 5 cents an hour, which is still heinous, but it's they'll poach the people from Nike, and then Body Armor or whoever, again, Reebok or I don't know, right, is going to do the same thing. Open a factory up in the next town over and be we'll pay you 7 cents. And then Nike's what? 9. I want to keep our employees, right? We already trained them. And then Adidas is going to be 11 and so on, right? So again, this is going to take many, many decades. And I'm not endorsing this argument. I'm not saying it's a good argument, but people will make this argument. And they will say that over time, what happens is this abject poverty eventually over a long period of time starts to cycle out of abject poverty because there's competition for labor. And when there's competition for labor, wages rise, and over time, an entire nation and billions of people can be pulled out of poverty. All right? So that's the kind of argument that I think that Mill would make. Mill would say inequality is okay. Sweatshops, exploitation, not okay, so let's not do that. But substantial inequalities he thinks are fine, because why? Because everybody benefits from that, even poor people, right? Even people who are living in abject poverty eventually over time get pulled out of abject poverty. People end up having smartphones, they have access to x-rays and CAT scans and stuff when they get sick in modern medicine. Inequality is not the worst thing in the world, is what Mill would say. If you remove some of this, it might be that the options are you have a lot of inequality, right? But the poor are slightly better off. And it might be the case that if you diminish that equality, what ends up happening is that the poor end up being worse off than they were when you had more inequality, right? So he would say inequality is not the worst thing in the world. What matters is standards of living, right? So the fact that Bill Gates has billions of dollars is who gives a shit? What matters is that the poor people are actually better off. That's what Mill would say. He's not a heartless, jerk, right? Again, I'm embellishing a little bit on Mill's argument. I'm not endorsing it. You might think that it's horrible. So let's turn to Peter Singer. I'm going to give you Peter Singer's argument next. Peter Singer, your boy. All right, so he is a professor of philosophy at Princeton. I believe that he's Australian by birth. He is a contemporary philosopher. He is still around. Very controversial philosopher. He cut his teeth, or at least got his original notoriety by talking about poverty, and that's what we're going to be talking about nowadays. He talks about stuff. I think does he talk about animal rights? I might be making that up. But he says some fairly controversial stuff. I think that he has recently made an argument that infanticide should be morally permissible. That is to say that it's sometimes morally permissible to kill a baby after it's born. In specific circumstances. He's not just like some kind of moral monster, but he is very controversial because he's willing to say stuff like this, and he makes arguments, right? He's a philosopher. He's doing his job. He's doing the best that he's trying to craft arguments and seeing how people respond to them, and we're trying to figure out what's what. So very controversial figure, but we're going to talk about what he has to say about poverty and inequality. So Peter Singer is a utilitarian. So he is a follower of Mill, but he would disagree with Mill pretty strongly about this issue of inequality. Mill is okay with substantial inequality, just not exploitation. Singer thinks that any type of substantial inequality is probably morally wrong, right? So what he wants to say ultimately, and he will not put it this bluntly, he's pretty blunt, but I don't think he even puts it this bluntly. I'm going to put it this bluntly. He basically says that unless you are giving pretty much all of your disposable income to the poor, you're a bad person. Again, he doesn't put it this bluntly, but he basically says, unless you're giving nearly all of your disposable income to the poor, you're being a bad person. All right, so we're going to have to see why he thinks this, though. So disposable income, what does that mean? That means that money that's left over after you cover your necessities, like food and shelter and clothing. So the stuff you spend on entertainment, that's all disposable income. And you're not, if you're spending that on Netflix or spending on going to the movies or on video games, instead of giving it to the poor, he is basically saying, again, he will not put it this bluntly, but he's basically saying is that you're doing something that's immoral. So when we think about giving money to the poor, we tend to think about, charity. And we think that if people are giving money to the poor, we're like, oh my gosh, you're such a good person. Right? You know what I mean? Like somebody gives like $100 to the poor and they're like, oh my gosh. Well, I don't even give anything, as we like eat our avocado toast or whatever. I don't even give anything. It's so good of you. We think that like any type of giving to the poor, any type of charity is like extra. It's like bonus. It's like extra to being a good person, right? Being a good person is just like not being a total asshole. And if you're giving money to the poor, that's like, man, you are like a saint. Obviously, I'm overstating, but you get the idea. We do think that it is like extra to being a good person. You don't have to do that. It's not morally obligatory. It's like you're doing it because you're such a wonderful person. Singer's like, yeah, it's wrong way to think about this. In fact, he thinks that giving nearly all of your disposable income to the poor is not bonus. He says that's what morality requires of you. That's why if you're failing to do it, you're doing something that's immoral and you're effectively being a bad person. Yeah. Okay, so how does he get there? He's a utilitarian. So he says that, an action is morally right if it produces the greatest amount of happiness for all people affected. And he combines utilitarianism with, this is on the study guide, with what's called the law of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility sounds really technical. It sounds really fancy. It's a term in economics. Economics has been insanely influenced by utilitarianism to the point that basically economics just is like a sub-branch of utilitarianism in many regards. The law of diminishing marginal utility sounds fancy and complicated, but it's really not. It can be explained easily with pizza. So I will do that in a second, but first let me tell you what you can write down. So the law of diminishing marginal utility is basically the idea that the more that you consume of a good, the less happiness you derive from it. So the more that you consume of a good, the less happiness you derive from it. All right, that's what it is. What the hell does that mean? Easy to explain with pizza. So imagine that you're like really, really, really hungry and you go into a pizza place like Tony's Pizza in North Wales. Oh my gosh, it's amazing. Anyway, you can tell them I sent you. Anyway, so love Tony's Pizza. So imagine you're really, really hungry and you go into Tony's Pizza and you order a full pizza because that's like what I do. I'm going to eat that whole damn thing. I'll take home whatever's left. I don't care. So you go into Tony's Pizza and you sit down and you eat the first piece of pizza. And that first piece of pizza, man, when you're hungry, is just like phenomenal. You're just like, oh, pizza. You just like chow that bad boy down. You're like, oh, so good, right? And then you get that second piece of pizza and you're like, oh, I love Tony's Pizza, so good. You like eat the second piece of pizza. Who am I imitating? Cookie Monster? I don't know. And the third piece of pizza, you're like, pizza, yay, pizza. And then you're like, fourth piece, pizza. Wow. And you're like, that's enough pizza, right? So the more that you consume of a good, the less happiness you derive from it. The first piece of pizza gives you like 10 happiness units. You're like, yeah, that's amazing. Then the second one is like 8 happiness units, and then like the third one is like 6, and then the fourth one is like 4. At some point, it's going to go into like negative numbers, right? If you try to eat too much, you're just going to be like, this is actually causing pain at this point. This is not causing pleasure. That's the law of diminishing marginal utility. The more that you consume of a good, the less happiness you derive from it, like essentially over time. All right, so let's combine that with utilitarianism. So imagine that you're going into Tony's Pizza and you're really hungry, but you go in with 3 other people who are really hungry and you're sitting around the table together and you order a piece of pizza and you eat that first piece of pizza and you do the whole thing over and again. Okay, so you can add up those numbers. What is it? If you eat the first piece of pizza, you get 10. If you get the second, you get 8. That's 18. If you eat the third, that's 6. That's what, 24. And you eat the last one, it's 28, right? So yeah, going down 2 each time. I'm just kind of arbitrarily deciding this. So once you've eaten that third piece of pizza and you have 24 happiness units, and you're sitting around the table with 3 other people who haven't eaten at all, think in terms of utilitarianism. What would produce the greatest amount of happiness, not just for yourself, but for all people affected, right? It's a moral theory. What would produce the greatest amount of happiness for all people affected? Should you eat that fourth piece of pizza? Well, it's going to give you 4 happiness units. But if you give it to one of the other people at the table, how much happiness is it going to give them? 10, right? So what would produce the greatest amount of happiness for all people affected? 28 versus 34, essentially. Yeah, obviously, the moral thing to do would be to give the other person that piece of pizza because they're going to derive more happiness from it than you are, and then you're going to end up with a greater amount of happiness overall. Yeah? All right, I can rinse and repeat. Now imagine you've just eaten the second piece of pizza and you're about to eat the third. That's going to give you 6 happiness units, but it could be you could give it to a person who has none. How much is it going to give them? It's going to give them 10. That's what you choose to do. Morality.